Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of CSM Practice, the podcast that brings you tactics that actually work in customer success to save customers, to make them adopt more, to become a loyal customer for a very long time. And one of the ways that we can do that is actually proving the value of what we do to customers internally. Customer success does have an impact. And one of the ways you can prove the impact is leveraging usage data. So I have a very special guest today that would unfold her story on how she started leveraging usage data and how it allowed her and her team to save very large customers because it allowed them to prove the value without having to rely on traditional metrics. So I'd like to welcome to the show our very special guest, Robin. Thank you for joining us today.
So happy to be here. Thank you, Yuri.
Robin Leathers, tell us a little bit about the circumstances of where this took place. How big was the company, or maybe like how big was the team, and what kind of clients were you helping?
Our team was relatively small, and we actually had quite a lot of accounts. So there was always a challenge trying to find out who's high touch, who's low touch. A lot of fire drills when we found out somebody should have been high touch when they've been low touch. And so there was just a lot of learning kind of throughout the years and dialing that in. In this particular case, we had a very large strategic account, and the usage was not necessarily looking particularly good. And so it came to renewal time, and we were starting to get a little worried that renewal was not going to go through.
We'll unfold that story in a second here. Just wanted to get kind of like the lay of the land. Sounds like you had a lot of accounts. Traditionally, every CSM had how many accounts in their book of business?
We had probably about 200 to 300 accounts
per CSM.
per CSM.
And some of them were large enterprise accounts.
That's correct.
I'm just going to interject and say, if you're in that position and you're an executive watching this interview, don't do that. Do you feel like enterprise companies that worked with you had different level of expectations from your CSMs than the smaller cohort?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, I feel like if you're a large strategic account, you typically expect a little bit more of the white glove service. And they definitely got it. Like there was a lot more attention paid to those accounts simply because there was more needs as well. But it was challenging because we couldn't just ignore all of our smaller accounts.
Tell me why calculating the ROI was so important.
There are some businesses, and this was one of them. We're in biotech business intelligence, where ROI is not particularly tangible. I've worked at companies before where we literally had ROI calculators. A customer can go in, type in a few things and say, oh, I could pay this off within 6 months. That's great. I'll sign the contract. But then there are some accounts where value is a little bit intangible, where it's not necessarily, I did this thing in the product and I got this thing out of it. And so that was definitely this particular product. And so because of that, it was very difficult to show value, especially through traditional usage metrics like how many users, how many hits on the website, etc.
Can you tell me what did you do? Because it seems like you still double down on usage data, but in a different way.
We were doing traditional usage metrics, just like you said. Part of it was because of bandwidth. Like that was what we could do. And so renewal time would come around. The customer would say, hey, I want usage metrics. I need users. I need website hits. I need maybe a couple other things because that's what they typically used in order to compare to other platforms. And that's when you say, hey, this one has high usage, so it must be high value. But we weren't like a Slack or a Salesforce or an Asana where you log in every single day and that showcases value. We were more like a chef's knife where you don't break it out every day to butter toast or to cut an apple, but you need it for that big family meal, and it is indispensable during that meal because you can't cut a big chicken with a butter knife. But that is difficult to showcase because a lot of the times who you're delivering these traditional usage reports to were knowledge managers or subscription managers at these big companies, and they weren't necessarily users. And so they didn't understand that usage did not equate to value. We were delivering usage reports that essentially were what they were asking for, but then realized a little bit too late in this case with this particular account, even though we did end up saving it, because they didn't understand the value of our product, and simply just providing these traditional usage metrics weren't telling the whole story. So what we ended up doing was freaking out a little bit, big fire drill, because we've all been there, where you have one of your most strategic accounts about to cancel and you're just calculating all of the new logos and all of the upsells and expansion opportunities you're going to have to close in order to make up for that one account. So you do all hands on deck. You bring everybody together trying to justify the renewal. But ultimately, it wasn't us who came up with the solution. It was the customer. And so what ended up happening is things are not looking great. There were severe budget cuts. We were on the chopping block. But a VP at this company stepped in and said, wait. He heard rumors that it was about to be canceled and said, no. This is not a nice to have. This is a need to have. And that was a wake-up call for us. That was when we realized, no, this isn't about how much people are using the product. It's not about getting them in there every single day. It is about who's using it. In this case, a lot of C-level VP folks who are using it and why they're using it to make strategic, critical decisions for the business. It wasn't just to do tiny little tasks that if that software goes away, it's not going to make a big impact. But if a VP is stepping in and saying, no, I need this product. So that's when we realized we had to find a different way to quantify this value. We had to tell a story about who was using it, why they were using it, and ultimately what would happen if it went away, what kind of business impact it was making. But those were all intangible and weren't things that we were reporting on yet.
And you were calling those data stories.
That's exactly what we did. So rather than creating usage reports, which we all have in some way or another, sometimes they're in products, sometimes you just do them manually. In our case, it was the latter. We started to actually, one, figure out how to quantify the intangible. So we did have to do some data cleanup and some filling the gaps and say, if we are deciding that who's using this product and why they're using it, and not just who, as in VP, C-level, but being used across the company, across business units, and it's affecting all parts of the company, we need to find a way to quantify that. So we did. We essentially just quantified kind of function and position, essentially who was using this and why they were using it. And then we told a story with that and created what we called engagement decks rather than usage reports. And those engagement decks, we talked about, hey, 35% of your users are VP and above. We currently touch 8 different departments in your organization. And so if you cancel the subscription, these are the types of people, and this is how many people are going to be affected. And then also telling the story about things like usage, website hits. That's not necessarily all the ways that customers engage with a product. We also had a newsletter that was very, very popular that had intrinsic value in it, but that was a lot harder for us to track and wasn't necessarily something being reported on. So we started including things like that or engagement trends. Yeah, usage isn't great, but it's actually double from last year and you renewed last year. So finding other ways to tell the story of value that wasn't just the basic, you've logged in this many times this month.
How did that resonate now that you came up with these data stories and engagement solution decks and had, I assume, a completely different meeting than you had before? What changes have you seen and what was the impact initially? How was it received by the client?
Huge changes. I mean, both internally and externally, because this didn't just change how we sent usage reports. Like that was the initial point of it, but it changed our internal conversations around, like, let's not just try to get more people to log in every month. Let's make sure we're getting the right people on the subscription, people who make these critical business decisions. Let's make sure we understand, like, why are all of these departments using this and for what reasons? There's different use cases. And then being able to kind of pull those out and then give that to the customer just provided so much more clarity into not just why they were using it, but why their peers were using it. And so that internal conversation changed, which was important. But once the internal conversation changes, it makes it a lot easier for the external conversation to change. So not only were you including these things in QBRs, onboarding calls, having this discussion, these are kinds of discussions, not just talking about how many people logged in, but what are you doing? Like, how can we affect that? Like, where do we come in? And a lot of this might seem obvious on the surface. A lot of people are probably saying, yeah, we do that all the time. But when's the last time you looked at how you're delivering all of your usage to customers? Like, not just meetings, discussions, how are you delivering usage in your product? Like if you have reports going out, or your CSMs and your sales reps and your finance team and whoever is sending anything to the customer, is it all touching the same points that you have discovered are very important? Or are some people just sending basic website logins and some people are digging into the value? Like making sure you have a coherent story and a really aligned story between your internal departments is important. So the impact we saw was, one, conversations were way more fun because you're not freaking out if you have low usage, because that's not nearly as important anymore. And then the customers were just way more engaged. Before, when we would send out some of this information in email, hear nothing back, just low response rates, we weren't even sure if they were reading it. We weren't even sure if they cared. But once we started including some of this more valuable data, not just to people keeping track of the subscription, but to people who are actually using the subscription, they suddenly wanted to talk to us. We were getting responses to our emails. We were getting more meetings on the calendar. Those meetings were helping us develop relationships with the people who were actually using the subscriptions and ultimately making the decisions of whether you renew or not. And so we definitely saw increases in engagement in that way.
So higher engagement, better relationships with the customers, and also internally, sounds like.
Yep, absolutely.
I think we got the gist of like the big shift from usage reports on how frequently and etc. to deep conversations around the impact that the usage or the having the application accessible in the right moment has had on the client's business. I think that if you have a small team with lots of customers digging into why is this important to client X or client Y is kind of hard if you have 200 or 300 accounts. And even if I had just 5, as a CSM, if I've never done this before, I might not understand the executive mindset, especially if there's multiple executives from different departments that are using my application. How did you overcome those challenges? And did you have any other challenges that the team or yourself were challenged with as you were implementing this new approach?
There's always challenges. I mean, I think the first one was simply that once we discovered the kind of data that we wanted to deliver on, we had to actually figure out how to get it into a format to be delivered. And so, like I said initially, we just didn't have that data. And so we couldn't just day one, wake up call, day two, everything's changed. We had to spend a lot of time, like one, going in and at least just doing the basics, like figuring out, we knew that who was using and why they were using was so important, but how do you quantify that? And so having those internal discussions in our case around how that was quantified. And sometimes it's what you come up with isn't perfect. It's like literally what data do we have and which data is closest to what we're trying to get across. You can't just obviously make things up. And so we did have a lot of that data that we did have to fill in some gaps over the course of a couple of months. But then once we did that, we were able to much more easily create a dashboard and put it into our account health metrics. That internal conversation, getting aligned on that piece, is the most difficult. And yes, you might have VPs all across the board and there's different use cases for every department, but the highest level value is ultimately the same. So if you can agree on what that is, and then over time develop the stories for each of the little segments, I think that is usually a good approach to go. So as long as you agree on the data, you figure out a way to quantify what might seem intangible, and then not all of that necessarily goes to the customer. Like sometimes it's just the most valuable things. They don't care about everything. They only care about things that affect them. And so ultimately, we started out by creating kind of a generic engagement deck, but then we started to create slightly more what I kind of like to think is micro segmentation within an account. So if we're talking to the VP of R&D or the VP of business development, they're going to care about different things. And so make sure that you're showing what they care about. And you learn that as you go through this process, and you should know your customers. So if you don't, then other people at your company will. And so having those conversations to kind of nail down those key points to include that most interesting information in those decks, I think is the best way to go.
If I can recap first, it sounds like step number 1, you made sure you have access to the data that your team needed. and gradually developed a dashboard that they can leverage. You created an engagement deck that was initially generic, and over time you were able to specify it for specific personas that you're working within those organizations. I wonder, from my experience, change management is important. And one of the ways that we can introduce a change and make it stick with our team or cross-functionally even is one, track success, and B, train, 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 and hold the team accountable with the right incentives. Can you share what worked for you to make this a successful initiative?
I think it was almost easier for us because it was almost intrinsic motivation at that point. Getting close to renewal, or even just 6-9 months before, you're looking at usage data and you're just starting to like, oh, this is, all right, guys, we got to work on this. This isn't looking good. And so being able to take a little bit of that stress off, I think, was a big motivator. And then also was just transforming how we were talking to customers. And suddenly it was easier to talk about why our products and our solutions are helpful beyond just, hey, how often are you using this? It just made it more fun. Like, these conversations just got so much more interesting for us, and I believe the customer as well. It went more into strategy and a lot less into just basic data. But to kind of on your point as well, we did not do this for every single account immediately. We had to prioritize. And so initially we just started with those top strategic accounts. And then even with that, we still further prioritized with the ones that did have low usage, where we knew that this was going to likely become a problem. Because if it was a problem at one big strategic account, you better believe it was a problem at other ones as well. So this wasn't just an outlier by any means. And so taking kind of that use case in that particular situation and then repeating it for the other ones. And then at that point, we started to find ways we could clean the data even further, automate some pieces. And I had a creative and insightful CS team. And so they were able to kind of create engagement emails that were a lot more interesting that we could send out to smaller accounts. So not necessarily as high touch, but still a value add. And so there were ways that we were able to implement this a little bit beyond the top tier of customers into the rest of the customer base.
What would you send to a SMB client, for example? Because you need to encapsulate the story. I mean, as you speak, I'm still kind of like, okay, if I don't understand the executive, how do I know how to speak their language? I think there's a lot of risk that you might just end up telling the wrong story, meaning a story, but it's not that meaningful to certain executives. So how do you overcome that?
It's a good question. I think ultimately it's our responsibility to know our customers and to work internally to, if you are confused or unsure. I mean, my team, if they were sending an email out to somebody they weren't positive what their use cases would be or kind of what they would find value in, it would be a discussion, and we would essentially kind of agree as a team at the best approach. If you're really concerned about hitting the wrong mark, there's always things that you can do that are a little bit more generic that still provide value. So for instance, we would call out people who were top users of the product or top users of the product in certain areas. And that would kind of create a sense of, oh, my peer who sits next to me in the office is using this. Oh, and they're using it for this reason. And it was all internal with them. So there was no private information we were giving away or anything like that. But it would kind of like create almost a sense of competition. So where there are things that you could kind of create emotion without necessarily saying, this is your use case and this is why you need us, but more kind of creating just engagement and a little bit more just interest in the product by using those methods.
If I were to start implementing it somewhere else at a different startup company, if you were to do this again, what would you recommend yourself in terms of metrics that you should track, either leading or lagging indicators, so that you can prove the impact of this initiative on the organization?
I mean, so this is not going to be appropriate for everybody. If you are a Slack or a Asana or a Zoom, your ROI is pretty easily proved, then you probably don't have to go through this effort. Your time might be better spent elsewhere. But if you are like a chef's knife, or in some cases a fire extinguisher, same concept, you don't need it until you do, then this is definitely something that's probably worth going through. So in our case, again, we found out that one of our biggest value propositions that this customer taught us was who was using the product. The CEO is using your product, and suddenly it gets canceled, that's going to make a bigger impact on the company than if an intern is. And so we discovered that that was important for us. For other companies, might be a little bit different, but there are kind of other components that could prove what that value is beyond who it is. Maybe it's streamlining key tasks. And if you take that away, suddenly that puts 20 hours on somebody's plate a week. What are those things that aren't necessarily used very often, but have a big impact when they are used? And so having that conversation to figure out what that is the most important thing. So for us, it was depth and breadth. Who's using it, top to bottom, and then who's using it also left to right as well. So I think just the impact it was making on the company as a whole was enough of a story that our customers started to listen a little bit more. So that was the probably the main component. There's a couple other pieces in there as well, but that was probably the sticking one.
How would you prove, if you had to do this again, how would you prove that this initiative worked? And what is the impact of the CSM team executing this initiative?
So this initiative was relatively new when I had left the company. So we didn't have huge quantitative metrics yet to point at, but the qualitative ones were clear enough for us that we are setting foundations for growth. The fact that people who would literally never even bother responding to emails before were suddenly agreeing to meetings, that was showing us that not only was this making an initial impact once we kind of streamlined it and iterated it to make better, we would continue to have those meetings where you can actually start to develop relationships with your users. Because one of the challenges we had before is we were talking to the knowledge managers or the subscription managers and not necessarily with the actual users. These engagement story, data stories were able to create space for us to be able to start having conversations with the users. And that allowed them to also come back to us if they had feedback or if they had questions or if they had issues. And so even over just the few months that we'd kind of created this and we had started to see it grow, we started to see significant increases in just how often our customers were responding to us, which customers were responding to us, and then how those conversations were going. They were much more about business impact, a lot less about how much they were actually using the product.
Yeah, so if I can make some suggestions to anybody here that's listening, we do have a video recorded on our channel about how to create a relationship score. Sounds like number of meetings, overall engagement, and the depth and breadth of the relationship between yourselves, the CSM, and the account has actually improved because of that. I would also assume that retention and upsell could also grow from it. So definitely track CSQL and overall renewal rate. That could be a lagging indicator if you have contracts that are 1 or 3 years in duration. So definitely from a leading indicator, I feel like the number one thing that has happened is that engagement with customers, less inactive accounts, more number of contacts that you had in the account, and the depth of the relationship.
That's exactly right. You nailed it.
Yeah. So I would say relationship score, learn how to do that and double down on it, because then you can show an improvement. I would bet that if you tracked CSAT or NPS, you could also see an uplift, because by sending that email and saying, hey, I know so-and-so is using it, here's why they're using it, here's the overall impact we have on our organization, a customer starts to feel like they're being seen. And so that by default creates a sort of a proximity with an account, even if you have 300 of them. And so I bet that NPS would also increase once they feel like you're actually looking at them, you care about them, you understand them. That's definitely going to improve NPS scores as well.
Perfect. Love it. And I have watched that video and it is very good. So I recommend it also.
I think we kind of went over the key things that you were going to do. Any key takeaways or additional resources that you found useful in executing this initiative that you'd like to recommend to anybody that's watching here?
If your product does not have a very clear ROI, you're very likely going to need to move beyond traditional usage metrics into things that might feel a little bit less tangible to quantify. But finding a way to quantify those can severely impact in a very positive way how you interact with your customers. So I highly recommend going through that process. The book I read recently also was called Unreceptive by Tom Stanfill. So it was made for sales reps, but it was about sort of what we're talking about today, like going past being simply an information or a data provider into a trusted advisor, into somebody who's not just trying to sell them more product, but somebody they trust to tell them why their product is helpful for them or what new ways they can interact with it to help their day to day. Because ultimately, that's what we're there for, is just to care about our customers and do what we can to just make sure their lives are a little bit easier in whatever way we can do that. And so I thought that book was kind of a good pointer towards that concept.
Well, if I were to then start something like that in my own organization, what are some of the initial steps that I need to consider? Do you have any tips for anybody that's listening and saying, yep, we definitely need that?
Have that internal conversation. If you have identified this as a problem, then it's time to take a step back. And we're not talking about building new value propositions for the marketing team. It's more about how are we presenting usage to customers today? And take a look along the entire journey. How is it being presented in the product? How is it being presented by different departments? And making sure that none of it is undermining the story that you're trying to tell. And making sure the story that you're telling is getting what you expect. If you are getting cancellations because of low usage data, but that's not actually how you show value in your product, then you need to find a way to tell a different story. And that's the hardest part, but that's going to be the way that you transform how you talk to your customers.
Listen, Robin, I really salute you. I think not to underestimate anything, but calculating ROI or showcasing and proving value you already delivered and the impact you have on accounts is tough stuff. Not giving up, stepping up to the plate, trying unconventional approach and being successful in it, actually having an impact, changing the conversation with clients, improving the relationship. I think it's commendable. And I hope you inspired others that are listening to do the same. I am going to include, with your permission, the link to your LinkedIn profile so that if anybody wants to take a stab at this and want to hear a little bit more from behind the scenes, reach out to Robin. Please do. I'm sure she'd be stoked to help you. And
Absolutely.
also, what inspired you about this conversation? Type it in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Robin, any final words? Anything you'd like to share with anybody before we wrap up?
I mean, the only thing is just thanks for what you do. I've been a part of the Mastermind program for a few months now, and it is just, I can't even start to talk about how valuable it is. And just the number of resources and templates that's provided as a part of that program is a game changer. You go from overwhelmed to actually having an easy place to start for so many different initiatives. And so, little pitch for you there, but it's a fantastic program. So thank you for everything that you do. You are an inspiration also.
All right, with that, it's a wrap. If you like this video, give it a like. If you want to learn more about the Mastermind program, check out the comments below. We have a link where you can apply for a meeting with me to learn more about it. And I'll see you at the next video.